Today I want to share with you how to make a French peasant beef bourguignon. This is a rustic, nutrient-dense recipe that's going to take us back to the Middle Ages. It's very different than what was popularized by the famous French chef Auguste Escoffier for French high society, and even more different than what was introduced to American audiences by Julia Child. This is a beef bourguignon that is perfect for the traditional foods kitchen. Hi, sweet friends. If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Mary from marysnest.com and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. I really love this recipe because it brings us back to the roots of what a real beef bourguignon should be like. A nutritious, nutrient-dense meal that really nourishes our body with all of the vitamins and minerals intact, with nothing removed. Now, nothing against Auguste Escoffier. He wanted to modify the original beef bourguignon to give it more of a refined appearance that would be appropriate for fancy French restaurants. But in doing so, certain nutrients were left out. And the whole point of these type of meals is that they were originally made by our ancestors in a nutrient-dense way. And by removing some of those elements, we create, yes, a lovely dish, somewhat you could call it a stew, but it's missing important things like collagen. And nothing against Julia Child either. She took Escoffier's recipe, which he started with a whole piece of meat, no bone. He started with a whole piece of meat, and she simply took that piece of meat and cubed it up, made it easy for the home cook to brown up and then forge ahead, turning it into a lovely beef Burgundy, in essence, stew. But again, the bone was not there. Certain nutrients were missing. But today, I'm going to show you how to make a beef bourguignon that's both very affordable and also the most nutritious form of beef bourguignon. So let's get started. Now let's go over the ingredients. The first thing that you're going to want to do is source 2 to 3 pounds of beef shanks, beef short ribs, or oxtails, or a combination. And you want to make sure that the bone is present in all of these. Now, beef shanks as well as short ribs are relatively easy to find, and they're usually quite affordable. If you can find oxtails and you can find them for a reasonable price, those work very well in this recipe as well. For this version that I'm going to make for you today, I use a little bit of each, both the shanks, the ribs, and the oxtails, so you can see how all of them cook up and blend together and how I handle them in preparing the final dish. Next, you're going to need 1 teaspoon of a fine ground sea salt, and then you're also going to want a half a teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper. You're going to need some fat to brown your meat in before we create the actual beef bourguignon. And you're going to want to use 2 tablespoons approximately to brown your meat. And you can use any type of fat that you like. Traditionally, peasants and peasant farmers and whatnot in the French countryside in Burgundy may have relied on lard, which was very common. You could also use goose fat or duck fat. You could use tallow if you want. You could even use ghee or clarified butter, whatever type of nutrient-dense, real fat that you keep right now in your traditional foods kitchen. You're also going to want to have about 4 ounces of salt pork. Now, if you can't find salt pork, no problem. You can easily substitute bacon for that. And whether you use salt pork or bacon, you're going to want to dice it up. Next, you're going to need 1 large onion. I simply used a yellow onion. You can really use any onion you like in this. And you're going to want to go ahead and dice up your onion. And just remember, don't throw away those onion skins. Add those to your scrap bag for your next batch of bone broth. Next, you're going to need 2 large carrots. You're going to want to keep them unpeeled And all you're going to want to do is a rough dice, a rough chop. And the same will be true for your celery. You're just going to want 2 stalks of celery and give it a nice rough dice, rough chop. You're going to need 1 whole bulb of garlic, but don't worry, there's no peeling involved. All you're going to do is cut the bulb of garlic in half. So now you have 2 halves with the cloves exposed, and that's perfect. The next ingredient is optional because it's not necessarily something that our ancestors would have done, but it is something that we commonly do today and something that's very affordable and easy for us to have in our kitchen. And that's to use flour, all-purpose flour, as a thickener. They relied on the collagen that was leached out of the bones in their meals as well as bone marrow, which we're still going to do that. But if you'd like, at this point, you're going to also want to include in your ingredients 1 tablespoon of all-purpose flour. And I'll show you how to incorporate that into the recipe when we go through the steps of how to make this beef bourguignon. Now let's talk about the wine. You're going to need 1 bottle of a Burgundy red wine. But the good news is, the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of money on this wine. You want to find an inexpensive Burgundy wine. The wine that our ancestors would have been using is more similar to an inexpensive wine than a fine wine that you might find today. Now, you don't want those cooking wines that you often see sold like in the vinegar or seasoning sections at your grocery store. Those often are laden with salt and other chemicals. You just want an inexpensive Burgundy. And I will tell you that someone recommended to me that I shop at Trader Joe's for this wine. My husband and I don't really drink. As you know, when I make bone broth, I keep some fortified wines on hand, but I generally don't have regular wine. And I have no connection or anything to Trader Joe's, but they said that they had very affordable wines. And so I said, okay, I'm going to head over to Trader Joe's. And I found a great Burgundy wine there for a few dollars. So you really can't go wrong if you live near a Trader Joe's. And I learned through some research that these wines, actually, it's interesting how they're made and actually can wind up being beneficial in the sense that the reason they're inexpensive is they're not aged a long time. They're generally not aged in wood. They're made in big stainless steel vats and so on and so forth. I don't know all the ins and outs of this. One day, since I live in wine country, in the Texas Hill Country, one day maybe we have to go to a winery and learn more about this. But in any event, when wines are made in this inexpensive way, they actually tend to be lower in histamines that can sometimes cause people to get a runny nose or a headache or whatever the case may be. So maybe we're onto something with these inexpensive wines. But in any event, just find, as I said, an inexpensive Burgundy, and it's going to be perfect for this recipe. Now, I do recommend using the entire bottle of the Burgundy wine that you choose because it's going to work wonders because of its acidity at leaching the nutrients out of the bones that are part of our recipe, that are on the meat that we're going to be using. However, if you are uncomfortable about using an entire bottle of Burgundy wine, you can do half and half wine and half water. And as a matter of fact, once we get all of our ingredients into the pot, if the wine doesn't cover everything, we will be topping it all off with additional water. The last few ingredients that you're going to need are 2 bay leaves and a half a teaspoon of dried thyme. Now, I'm making this in the winter time, and that's a good time to make a meal like this, but if you do have fresh thyme on hand, you can certainly use it. You're just going to need about a teaspoon's worth. Finally, you're going to need 10 pearl onions, and you're going to want them peeled. Now, if your grocery store sells them in the frozen food section in a bag, you'll be ahead of the game. And I would never tell you not to use those because it definitely makes life easy. But if not, what I did was I found pearl onions at my local grocery store, and I just peeled them up. Then you're going to want about a half a pound of plain, simple white button mushrooms. Just clean them up, cut them in half, And then last but not least, you want a little bit of parsley, a little bit of fresh parsley that can just make for a nice garnish on top that you can sprinkle when you go to serve your dish to give it that sort of fresh, bright look, as well as taste, especially since I like to use flat leaf Italian parsley and I find that it does have a lovely flavor. Now you may see recipes out there for making beef bourguignon in the more modern way that talks about marinating meat overnight and so on and so forth. Yes, you could marinate your meat overnight, but I really don't find it necessary. I think the fact that we are going to be cooking this in wine and cooking it for quite a few hours to leach all those good nutrients out of the bones, that the flavor develops beautifully. So this is something that you can decide to make in the morning or even in the afternoon and have ready for dinner. Let's go through all the steps now from making the beef bourguignon. The first thing that you're going to want to do is simply season whatever cuts of meat you're using with your salt and your pepper. And just make sure that you season both sides of whatever meat you're using. Next, you're going to want to get a heavy bottom pan. I really like to use a Dutch oven, and you're going to place that on your stovetop, and over medium heat, you're going to go ahead and add in whatever fat that you're using to brown your meat. You're going to let the fat melt, and once it's melted, you're going to go ahead and start putting your pieces of meat into your Dutch oven or heavy bottom pan, pot, whatever you have, and you're going to brown your meat on each side. It varies, it can take anywhere from 3 to 4 minutes or so to brown the meat on each side on medium heat. And now don't crowd things. Just put the meat in depending on the size of the pan you're using or the pot you're using. And as it browns and reaches a nice color that you like, then simply transfer it to a plate outside of the Dutch oven. And since I was using a Dutch oven, as we go through this recipe, I'll be using the term Dutch oven, but certainly whatever pot that you're making this in will work just fine. But a nice heavy bottom pot always works well for long, slow simmers. It prevents burning on the bottom and it retains the heat beautifully. Once all your meat is browned and removed to a platter, now you're going to go ahead and add your salt pork into the Dutch oven. And you're going to brown that up until it crisps nicely. That can take 4 to 5 minutes. Once that crisps up beautifully, you're going to want to remove that. A slotted spoon can work very well, or even tongs, whatever is easiest for you to be able to remove it from the Dutch oven. And just go ahead and add it to the platter where you have put your browned meats. Now do not remove any of the fat that has rendered from the salt pork or any of the remaining fat that you initially put in to brown your meat from the Dutch oven. Whatever fat is in your Dutch oven, leave that in there. That is a nutrient-dense food and is going to flavor up the next step where we add the vegetables. It's going to flavor up the vegetables beautifully. Now into your Dutch oven, into that nice hot fat, you're going to go ahead and add your diced onion. Now, not the pearl onions that we talked about at the end. Those actually go into the beef bourguignon at the end. What we're going to be using now is our diced onion, our diced rough chopped carrots, and our diced rough chopped celery. Then mix everything with the fat and let that saute for about 5 minutes until you notice that the onions are becoming somewhat translucent, the carrots and celery are beginning to soften, and everything just smells wonderfully fragrant. That should take approximately 5 minutes. Now, at this point, if you want to use the flour, you're going to go ahead and sprinkle that tablespoon of flour over the sauteed vegetables, your onions, carrots, and celery. Then you're going to mix that all up very well, and you're going to continue to saute that for about 2 minutes. You just want to cook off any raw flour taste and help with some of the browning on the bottom of your pot, on the bottom of your Dutch oven. Then, after 2 minutes, you're going to want to get your wine and pour the wine into your Dutch oven using your spatula, whatever you have, to start to scrape up any brown bits that have formed on the bottom of your pan. Now, as you deglaze your pan with the wine, you want to turn your heat up to high. And you want to scrape up those brown bits, and then you want to go ahead and add in your bay leaves and add in your dried thyme or fresh thyme, whichever one you're using. Next, add in all your meat and your salt pork or bacon, whatever you used. And make sure that any drippings that are on the platter are also poured back into your Dutch oven. And then, if need be, and the meat is too exposed on top, you'll want to add a little more water, or a little, if you've used any water in the first place, if you did half water and half wine. If you used all wine, this is the first time you're adding water. But you'll just want to add some water to make sure that most everything is covered under the liquid. At this point, hopefully your liquid has come up to a boil, and all you have to do is just carefully nestle in those two halves of your whole garlic bulb. And you can just push them down in. I was doing it very gingerly with my fingers. You can certainly just use a spoon to lower them in, whatever the case may be. But you just put one on each side of your pot. At this point, you want to go ahead and put the lid on your Dutch oven and turn your heat down to its lowest setting. If you'd prefer to do this in the oven, you certainly can. You can take your Dutch oven or your oven-proof pan, whatever you're using, put it into an oven that's been preheated to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, whether on the stovetop or in the oven, you're going to let your beef bourguignon in the making simmer for 3 hours. This long, slow simmer will leach the collagen out of the bones, help dissolve any cartilage that may be on the bones, especially if you're using oxtails, and it will also simmer the bone marrow beautifully, cooking it and allowing some of it to be disseminated into the liquid in which your beef bourguignon is cooking. But we'll talk about the bone marrow in a minute. Now, over the course of those 3 hours, as your beef bourguignon is simmering, you may want to periodically just check on it, make sure it's not bubbling too aggressively, make sure that everything is nicely submerged under the liquid, and make sure nothing's sticking to the bottom. It really shouldn't on such low heat, but it is good just to check it once or twice periodically over that 3-hour cooking time. At the 3-hour mark, you're going to remove the lid from your Dutch oven, and you're going to add in your peeled pearl onions and your mushrooms and give everything a nice stir. Put the lid back on your Dutch oven and let everything simmer for about another 30 minutes. You're basically looking for the little pearl onions and the mushrooms to just become tender. Now, this is I guess you could say, the nutrient-dense part of the recipe, and it's an important part of the recipe. What I recommend is that you use a slotted spoon and you remove as much of the solids, the meat, the pearl onions, the mushrooms, any of the carrots, celery, and diced onions that may still be intact. Remove everything to a platter, but leave all of the liquid in your Dutch oven. Now, history to a certain extent tells us that our ancestors probably just ate this as is. They ate the meat right off the bone, had the sauce, had their vegetables, scooped the bone marrow out of, like if for example, they were using shanks and they had the bone with the bone marrow in it, maybe they scooped it out, maybe they used it, spread it on some bread. It might have been served in a very rustic manner and eaten in a rustic manner. And we can certainly do that. If you've never had bone marrow spread on toast points, you're in for a treat. It's delicious. It's basically steak butter. If you like steak and you like butter, you're going to love bone marrow. But if that's something new to people, and yourself or your family, your friends, whomever, aren't quite ready for being served such a rustic meal, this is what I recommend. As I mentioned, use a slotted spoon to remove everything to a platter. You now have liquid in there. Some of the bone marrow may have leached out from the bones that were from the shanks. There may have been some sinew that loosened, maybe from the short ribs. Whatever the case may be, leave all of that in there floating around. Then look at the meat on your platter. If any of the meat still has the bone marrow intact, I like to use a grapefruit spoon, a serrated grapefruit spoon, and take that marrow out of the bone, add that into your Dutch oven, into the liquid. If you've seen my video on how to make bone marrow soup, cream of bone marrow soup, I go through a detailed explanation of removing the marrow and why I like using a serrated grapefruit spoon. It's sort of a two-in-one tool. You can use the spoon if the opening of the bone is wide enough, and if not, you can just flip it over and use the handle of the spoon to get the bone marrow out. But you want to put all of that back into your sauce, into what's in the liquid in your Dutch oven. Then you want to look over, especially the shanks, the perimeter, I guess you would say, of the shank. Some of what runs along the short ribs is something that sometimes will hold them together. It may have loosened significantly during the 3-hour cooking time. You want to, that's like sinew and different connective tissue. You want to remove all of that, and you want to put that back into your Dutch oven. That's loaded with nutrients, loaded with collagen. It's wonderful for digestive health, wonderful for making a healthy digestive system, and a healthy digestive system can better absorb all the nutrients in our food. So it's very important that you get all of that back into the liquid in your Dutch oven. Then what you should be left with is the meat and the bones. Now, don't throw out those bones. Save the marrow bones from the shanks, save the rib bones from the short ribs, and especially if you've used oxtails, save those oxtail bones, because it's highly unlikely that after a 3-hour or a 3.5-hour simmer, that those oxtails, that the collagen, you'll see the cartilage on those oxtails has dissolved completely. It's highly unlikely. There should be some cartilage still intact. And so all of those bones, and especially the oxtails, are wonderful for you to throw into your next batch of bone broth. The marrow bones, yes, they may no longer have the marrow, but chances are there's still some more collagen that can be leached from the actual bones. Same as the rib bones. And as to the oxtails, as I said, not only will there be the collagen that you can leach from the actual oxtail bone, there is certainly some cartilage that you're going to see on either end of the oxtail that can dissolve in a future batch of bone broth. So into a scrap bag and into your freezer, all ready for your next batch of bone broth. Now, as you're removing the meat from the bones and getting off the sinew, getting out the marrow, whatever the case may be, you can use your hands, your clean hands, as you're doing this, to also, the meat is basically going to be so tender and falling off the bone, it's going to be luscious. And you can basically use your hands to break it up into bite-sized pieces. It's really up to you, however you want to handle this. Now, leave that set aside for a while. Then you can either use a blender or a stick blender for the next step. And if you're using a stick blender, you're basically going to want to turn off your heat. Make sure, when you're taking everything out, that you have turned off your stove at that 3.5-hour mark when everything is done. And you're going to get your stick blender and you're going to put it down into your Dutch oven, pot, whatever you're using, and you're going to start pureeing everything. You're going to puree the bone marrow and the sinew, any cartilage that's softened and that has fallen into the sauce, and you are going to make the most luscious, most nutrient-dense, most nutritious beef bourguignon sauce you have ever had, because all of that you are pureeing is extremely nutrient-dense. And it's a wonderful way. Really, bone marrow is like, it's just the most perfect food in the world, in my humble opinion. And along with the sinew, pureeing all of that into a sauce where no one knows that they're eating the sinew, no one knows they're eating the bone marrow. And if you are at the beginning of your traditional foods journey and you're trying to introduce these foods to your family, this is a great way to do it. So once you get that pureed, and if you want to use a blender, you can do that too. You may have to do it in batches. But once everything is pureed and in the Dutch oven, now you're going to go ahead and add back into the Dutch oven your meat, your mushrooms, your pearl onions, any other carrots, the mirepoix mix as it's known, the carrots and the diced onions and the celery, all back into the Dutch oven, into that luscious, I mean just mouth-coating, scrumptious sauce. Stir everything nicely so everything is well coated. If it's cooled off at all, you can just warm it up a little on low, and now you're ready to serve. Well, hopefully what I've got here is a beef bourguignon that our ancestors would be proud of. Well, let me give it a taste and I'll tell you how it came. Oh, that's delicious. The meat is so tender and the sauce is so rich thanks to the bone marrow and the sinew that we have dissolved into it. Not to mention, it's extremely nutrient dense, but delicious is what matters. And I think that you are going to absolutely love this. This dish is wonderful ladled into maybe a nice large soup bowl, along with mashed potatoes, one of my favorites, or egg noodles, one of my husband's favorites, or even rice. And then sprinkle everything with a little fresh chopped parsley, and you're good to go. You have a nutrient-dense meal similar to what our ancestors ate in the Middle Ages. And now if you'd like more nutritious meals like this, more nutrient-dense meals, be sure to click on this video over here where I show you how to make a real pot roast with a bone-in chuck roast, bone marrow soup, and a whole host of other things that are nutrient-dense and perfect for our traditional foods kitchens. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.